So, President Bacon, thank you so much for this conversation, for sitting down with me to discuss neuroscience and life and to share your story with our student. Thank you.
Neuroscience and life, I like it. Happy to be here.
So, I guess I want to start at the beginning. Do you remember what initially sparked your interest in psychology and neuroscience, and I guess what drew you into those topics?
Consciously, because there's always a conscious and an unconscious part. Right. Consciously, I was a summer camp counselor. I was working with children and teenagers, many of whom came from social services, had difficult family lives. I loved the job. I thought that's what I want to do. I want to work with children. I want to help them out. I felt ill-equipped. I was about 17 years old. I felt ill-equipped to help them. I felt I didn't have the knowledge. So I went into psychology. That was my first degree, was psychology. But unconsciously, though that was unclear to me at that time, I also came from a difficult background. I knew that, but I didn't know how deeply it was affecting me. I think unconsciously I was looking for answers. Unconsciously I was looking for sense, for meaning, for a different way to think, a different way to live. And I think unconsciously psychology offered that. So I enrolled at Concordia University and loved my experience. And then what happened through this is you start to hear about this 3 pounds of matter we have in our head that we call the brain. I'd never really thought about my own brain. And you realize suddenly, and this was a real awakening, you realize that everything that you see, everything that you hear, everything that you think, everything that you feel, everything that you do, everything that you decide is a result of brain function, what happens in that 3 pounds of matter. So I wanted to know more about that. So I put psychology aside. I did a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Montreal. I focused on visual perception, how we manage to see the world. Maybe in part because as a young child, my parents were too preoccupied with their own problems to realize that I couldn't see well. Until I was about 9, 10 years old, when I got my first glasses, I saw the world well for the first time. So maybe unconsciously that played a role too. So I studied visual perception, which is a good entry into neuroscience. We know just enough about visual perception to be able to correlate to some degree the work of the neurons and what we see better than in some other disciplines, at least in 1990. And that's led to 30 years of teaching in psychology and neuroscience.
Wow, amazing. I'm smiling because, first of all, I didn't know that you started in vision studying. This was also my beginning in neuroscience. I was also in a vision-based lab. Yeah, and it's a great model to start neuroscience, so I agree. So maybe reflecting back at your early years in university, what was it like for you, like for young Benoit as an undergrad?
It was a liberation. On the one hand, I got to escape the home where I grew up in to go to university, which was fantastic. Maybe I should say a little bit about that. My dad was fighting his own demons. He was a very smart guy. He was a surprisingly successful guy, given how much he drank. But his unhappiness was so deep. He was unable to live with himself. And some of the ways that he coped with that was by spreading the unhappiness. He was very controlling. He was tyrannical. He was mean. He was abusive. He drank a lot every day. And when you live in that kind of house with somebody like this, it's very difficult. You're always in fight or flight mode, but because you're a child, you can neither fight nor take flight. So all that's left to you, that's classic neuroscience, is a freezing response. That means your whole system is pumping you full of the hormones that would want you to take action, but you can't take any action. So all of this remains frozen inside you, and that's what happens. You increasingly freeze. You dissociate from yourself. You dissociate from your emotions. It's a protective response. And when I left home, I thought, I'm finally free. I'm going to live a beautiful life. I'm going to be free. And in one way you are, but in one way you're not, because wherever you go, all that's inside you is with you. So as a student, I took advantage of that freedom to read, to study. I was a surprisingly good student. I'd never been a good student in high school. Suddenly I was a better student at university. Enjoyed the material immensely, but some of the things that were inside me were inescapable. So I did have substance use issues for the longest time, from the time I was about 15 into my 40s, really, peaking in my 20s and 30s. I needed a series of maladaptive behavior to cope with my ill being inside, right? And that's the nature of addiction. I think that's also core neuroscience. What's the nature of addiction? We think the substances are addictive, or we think the behaviors are addictive. They're not really. What's addictive is the relief that they bring from the pain or the emptiness that you feel inside.
Right.
So you're unable to live with yourself. You're unable to live with your thoughts. You're full of fear. You're full of shame. You're full of anger. And the substances alleviate that. Promiscuity alleviates that. Relationship drama allows you to focus on something else and alleviates that. It also feels familiar, and that alleviates that. So I think that's how I was as a student. I was both happier than I've ever been, but also struggling to heal from what was inside me, which took a long, long time.
This is fascinating. I hear so many different things and so many different, truth that occurred at the same time. Because you say, I was high functioning, I was successful, I was liberated, and I suffered. And I think that's so interesting and probably also validating for many of our students, because I think very often we are presented with success stories as if they happen linearly, seamlessly, like the person was born a rock star, and often it's not the case in reality. Life is messy, humans are messy. So I really appreciate it, first of all, that you bring the truth and openness about your story. And I also hear that you're touching upon something that I also think is very common, where some of our survival strategies or coping mechanisms that might save us at first, that were very effective at first, might not be successful or sustainable in the long term. Some of our surviving or coping mechanisms become the problem later. And I think you're right when you say at first it's not the problem, that's the solution. We need to survive something really hard, but then it's not sustainable. So can you also share, what are the resources? I'm thinking internal, external resources that you found that made the biggest difference for you?
I think we're all on a mental health spectrum in different parts of the year and different parts of our lives, going up and down. Some of those rhythms have to do with what's inside of us. And obviously, some of those rhythms have to do with how what's outside of us evoke different things inside of us. The outside world is never the cause of poor mental health, but the way that the external world puts pressure on our inner wounds, trauma, which is almost always intergenerational trauma, really leads people to have ups and downs. Then this notion of using substances or other means to cope, they're coping mechanisms, to cope with your unhappiness, to cope with your fear, cope with your shame, cope with the mental health issues. Until recently, I was quite ashamed of some of the things that I did. It's not a good feeling to look back on your life and to say, wow, I've lost 20 years using substances and not being there. You wish you'd done it differently. But recently, I've more than made peace with that. Now I'm proud of the little guy that did what he had to do to keep going, to survive. And I'm thankful that he was able to do this, because that led to the possibility of healing in a different way. But that's the catch of all those addictions. They work in the short term, but in the long term, they're very destructive. That's the catch with all these addictions, whichever it is. It will always lead down into hell. You asked what were the supports. That was your question. What were the supports back then? They were surprisingly few and far between as a student. Back in the early 90s, no one spoke about mental health at university. University was also a place where drinking and using substances was encouraged and even made you cool. So it was very easy to hide in that crowd, and nobody ever asked me, "Are you okay?" No, nobody ever. Professors, neighbors, friends, nobody ever asked me, "Are you okay?" In part because I went to great length to conceal the fact that I was not okay. I think the material itself was a support. To read about narcissism, for example, and to understand that some of the people that had a negative impact in my life were of that ilk, and to try to understand, at least cognitively. It takes a long time to understand it in your heart, but to understand at least cognitively some of the things that have happened to you. So my new addiction, starting then for about 15 years, was to seek refuge in my thoughts, in my head, which is a different form of addiction, which also doesn't work in the long term, but makes you functional and provides a bit of space to live, to perform, to be normal, until such time as a different kind of healing can unfold. And eventually it did.
So the resources were a lot of, so you say the material, the content, the psychology itself, which I think is fascinating, and your own thoughts and meaning making, right? Is that right?
There's a lot of comfort if you're disconnected from your emotions, and your body is full of unresolved tension from unresolved fear responses, fight-flight responses. And you're full of those negative emotions, mostly shame. You were conditioned to think that you were shameful in your very nature. Thinking is an incredibly powerful refuge. You can decide, and a lot of people do, much more than we like to admit. You can decide to live the life of the mind, and uniquely the life of the mind. And academia is the perfect setting for that. Academia is the temple of the mind, which sounds beautiful. But the part that we don't say when we say academia is a temple to the mind is academia is not interested in the heart. And for me, that worked for a long time. I'm just going to study, I'm going to read, I'm going to think, I'm going to be rational, I'm going to be logical, and all that ugly stuff. It's irrelevant, actually, because I'm living the life of the mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like parts of you go to exile in order to preserve the other parts.
Right on. But there's another way to live, I found out. I didn't know. Nobody ever told me this. Well into my 40s, and that's my one regret, I went into therapy. Too late. I wish I'd gone when I was 15. And one of many things that the therapist wanted me to do was talk about how things made me feel. And I never knew how to answer that question. I had no vocabulary for it. Through a number of sessions, you realize that there's other things inside of you than your personality and your ego, and then you have to recapture all of this. And it's a long journey. What you do find is that you're not your thoughts at all. Your thoughts are mostly self-generated by the brain, based on what you've seen and learned before, based on your programming, based on your conditioning. And when you start watching your thoughts, if you're able to quiet your mind just enough to be able to watch your thoughts, you won't believe the nonsense that you think. And if you watch them long enough, you realize that whereas you thought you were the thoughts that float around in your mind like clouds, you'll see that no, in fact, you're the sky, and the clouds are just floating in there. They're not different from the objects that you perceive in the world. So this is very close to the subject of my research. How do you perceive objects? How do you perceive thoughts? There's no real difference. They're both the result of brain function. And the more you watch your thoughts, the more distance there is between yourself and your thoughts, the less grip they have on you. And as this grip lessens, in that space emerges a different way of being that is not ego-based, that is closer to the core of who we all are.
So how do you, I know there are different ways to practice that. I'm thinking about mindfulness, I'm thinking about, there are different ways. What is your way to practice your agency, to be in the position of the observer?
I meditate every day. I think the key is always to be fully present, and I work on this every day. Whatever you're doing, be fully in the moment. And your mind always tries to bring you back to the past and all your recriminations and all that should have happened, or into the future and what you want to happen and what you need to do now to get that stuff. So presence is really important. You mentioned mindfulness. I'm interested in the discourse around mindfulness because it says if you practice mindfulness, you'll be more successful at your work. And my view is your work must become the practice through which you will become more mindful.
Yeah. When you look back, at the challenges and the struggles and the dark times as well, do you find any maybe unexpected positives or gifts in, everything you've been through in those dark times or challenges? I mean, I know that there are a lot of great outcomes. Obviously, you're a very successful individual, but can you frame some of those things now as gifts to say, I'm grateful for those things?
All of those things, every single one of those things. I used to think, oh my God, it's so awful. I'm so unlucky. I'll never get out of this. Life is terrible. I thought I would die young. I'm surprised I'm still alive today. And now I'm coming to grips with the likelihood that I'm going to live into old age. It's very strange. The bar none, the most surprising part of the healing journey or deprogramming journey is the immense gratitude that I have for everything, including my dad, including the suffering. I'm just so grateful for everything that he did for me. I'm full of tenderness for the suffering that he had to go through. And even with that suffering, he managed to raise me. He managed to feed me. He managed to take care of me. He wasn't perfect, but it's heroic, right? So I'm extremely grateful for that. I'm grateful for my mom who never defended me efficiently. She didn't have it in her. She was codependent. I'm grateful for all the care that she managed to give me on the side. As it was happening, she was always there to console and to make me feel better. Ram Dass says suffering is grace. I always thought this was nonsense. How can suffering be grace? Turns out it can be. And for me, it has been. The whole journey of healing, as far as I can tell, is to move your inner life from shame and fear into compassion and love. And once what you feel inside is compassion and love, it transforms the whole world. It transforms the past, it transforms the present, and it transforms the future. The past that used to be so dark, so bleak, is just what it is. The present is nowhere as dangerous as it used to be. Is just opportunities. When things go well for you, great. If things don't, well, it's an opportunity to learn and to heal some more. And once these two things have changed, fearing the future makes no sense at all.
Right. Yeah. I guess I wonder how neuroscience has shaped your worldview beyond the science itself.
All the great Formula One drivers, they're also mechanics. They know how the motor works, and it helps them to be better drivers. Doesn't that just make sense?
Yeah, I love it.
I think knowing about the brain, by definition, helps you as a human being, because so much of what we are depends on brain function. It's shocking to me how most of us operate daily without knowing the first thing about brain function. Isn't that bizarre? I'm very grateful that I got to delve a little bit into the functions of the brain. I say a little bit because we know almost nothing. But let's be honest about this. The study of visual perception is fascinating. We think that we have direct access to the world. We think the world is there in that exact form, and that through our senses, we get to experience it directly and simply. It takes less than 6 months of trying to study visual perception to realize all of this is a complete illusion. We don't have direct access to the world. We have completely indirect access. All we have direct access to is light. And light bounces off the world and into our retina, and from then on, it's only electrical potentials that fly through various areas of your brain, and somehow the brain gives you perception. But we need to be very humble about this. Is the perception that our brain gives us anywhere near what the real world looks and feels like? We have no idea. I tend to think of it more as an interface. It's a VR helmet, really, that allows us to interact with the world. So just that, how we see the world, made me much more humble about what I know and what I don't know, and the basis on which I know.
Yeah, we don't perceive the world as it is. We perceive it as we are. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We perceive it as we are.
Yeah. I'm very excited about teaching neuroscience, and especially teaching neuroscience to undergrads for many reasons. But one of them is that often the case, like most of the time, their brain is still developing. So what do you think is the value in studying neuroscience while your brain is still developing for our undergrads?
I'm over 50 now. It's so tough to learn anything new. The things that I've learned recently, I always need to remind myself of them. It's hard to explain. The things that you learn early, you'll always know. They'll be foundational, right? And we can argue when and where that stops, but it's somewhere in your 20s. I learned English at 17, 18 years old. I tried to learn Czech at 27, 28 years old. It was a very different experience. There's a reason why schooling is early in life, right? Including university. And you're right to point out that the frontal lobes are not fully myelinized until 20, 25, especially in boys. Is it a good thing to have access to fundamental learning about our nature early in life? Should it be earlier? Should neuroscience be taught earlier? Probably. Is it early enough at university? Probably. Should non-neuroscientists have access to at least the basics of neuroscience? Probably.
And I want to bring us back to where we started with young Benoit. And I wonder from, with your perspective today, with your experience, from your vantage point today, what advice or anything would you say to your young self, or any student who's facing, similar, I guess, challenges or experiences?
So if I was to speak to my younger self and say, this is what's happened to you. Your parents were in no state to raise children. They did their best for you, but they left immense scars inside of you. Now your responsibility is to heal. This is how we're going to go about this. You're going to put aside other pursuits. You're going to focus on the basics. We're going to try to go to bed early. We're going to completely change how we eat. You can't eat that crap. We're going to exercise every day. We're going to meditate every day. My young self, I said, who are you? And what do you know? Right? People have tried, How about you try this, you try that? Eat some vegetables from time to time. Don't drink so much. It's very difficult. The business of living is experiential, right? It's limited what you can learn by being told by other people. What I would like to say to my young self is the same thing that I always say when I speak in public. You're suffering, and you're not alone. A lot of people suffer. Do you suffer? Yes, I hear you. Lots of people suffer. That's okay. Acknowledge it. Don't repress it. You're suffering. You don't have to suffer by yourself. You can talk about it. And to reach out for help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength, turns out. When you're hurting too much, when you're too ashamed, you can't. But when you find the strength to reach out for help, it's a sign that you're on the right path. And healing's always possible. Don't doubt that. You think you're going to die young? I don't think you will. I think you will find a way to heal, especially if you take conscious steps towards that. So that's what I say to your students today. If you're suffering, that's okay. Lots of people are suffering. You don't have to suffer alone. Speak about it, reach out for help, and healing's always possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great. It was great to speak with you and to learn more about your class and about your students. Thank you for everything that you do. It was a real pleasure.
It was my pleasure. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you.